Hello, everyone. Hello, hello. Oh, thank you. Thank you. Hello and welcome to AIPAD Talks. My name is Andra Russick. I am the chair of the Education Committee, and I am very excited to be introducing this talk today and a few of the other talks. I want to thank you all for being here, and I want to thank you for coming to the show and remind you that we have a whole slate of amazing talks going on this weekend. And if you miss some of them, it's okay because they will be available online on our website at apad.com. So now, as part of our On Collecting series, we're having this amazing talk on 19th century photography. And I want to introduce some of our panelists and our moderator. We have Patrick Montgomery, an esteemed 19th century photography collector. Hans Kraus Jr., I'll say a renowned dealer of 19th century photography from Hans Kraus Jr. Fine Arts. Dr. Katie Addleman, thank you, Addleman, Curator of Photography and New Media at the Canadian Centre for Architecture. Dr. Sarah Kennel, the Aaron Siskind Curator of Photography and Director of the Raysor Center of Works on Paper at the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts. And our moderator for today, Russell Lord, who is the Chief of Curatorial Affairs at the Norman Rockwell Museum. And with that, I'm going to pass it on to Russell, and I hope you all enjoy this talk, and thank you again for coming.
Thank you. Thank you all for being here. Is this volume is good? You can hear me okay? All right. Well, it's an honor to be here. I think a lot of you know that my chief area of expertise is 19th century photography, despite the fact that I now work with a 20th century painter. But I can assure you we do have photographs in the collection up there, and I'm still very much involved and delighted to be with all of these panelists. I thought we would just sort of start off very briefly with, I always like to sort of ask the question, why? Why should we be interested in these kinds of things right now? And obviously the topic of the day is 19th century photography. So why should we make an argument for 19th century photography? It's no secret to everybody here that photography is increasingly a part of our lives and increasingly a part of the way that we communicate. Even on social media, text is being more and more replaced by images. Images are kind of used as text. And so I got into this field because I was interested in learning where this phenomenon came from and how we might be able to kind of look back to the roots of photography to think about solutions to today's visual literacy problem. So I'm very interested in exploring where photography came from to understand where we might be going as a people in the future. And I know that my fellow panelists here are all very devoted to this subject. So I'm going to start off with a blanket question that I'll ask them all to answer in their own words and on their own terms. And then we'll have a discussion about 19th century photography and specifically collecting it today. So my first question, and we'll start with Patrick, is what is the state of 19th century photography today to you, in your opinion?
Okay. I think it's a very exciting time to be collecting this kind of material. I've been doing it for about probably 20 years. And when I started, it was, when the internet was coming up, and it really transformed the way you could collect this material. Before then, it was difficult. I mean, you came to places like AIPAD, and maybe you got lists in the mail from dealers. But there were auctions, but you had to go there, or be on the phone. Now you can literally attend an auction anywhere in the world, and in your pajamas, and you can find lots of things on places like eBay. There's a lot of things like the Daguerrean Society, which is now sort of expanding into all kinds of 19th century photography. So it's I find collecting it really fascinating because it wants me to, the pictures suck me into their stories. There's so much to learn about not just photography, but history and social science. And, if you're the kind of collector who really likes to know what it is you're collecting, it's such a rich field. So
That's great.
Yeah.
Hans, before you start, I'll just
Yeah.
say that we've asked the panelists to provide some slides, so we'll just be sort of cycling through them as we go. But each of these were chosen by the panelists as examples. Hans?
Thanks, Russell. Well, we find ourselves right now in between two anniversaries. There was the 150th anniversary of photography in 1989, and that was a time that generated a tremendous amount of energy into the field and brought in new collectors, new museums. There was just about every museum had to have an exhibition of photography at that time, and there was a lot of media attention, and that began some new collectors, which are still collecting. Some of them are getting more and more active. Some are getting less active. As that generation is starting to age out, we're finding that prices are getting softer. And this is something that we have to reckon with. And it's a very interesting period because we're finding that there are plenty of opportunities now, as Patrick pointed out, that there are opportunities for acquiring things at prices that are more accessible. And that's an important factor. We're now at a point where there are new people used to be focusing on very specific areas, whether it be nationalities, whether it be subject matters, whether it be particular points of view. Now I'm seeing much more generality, much more of an understanding of looking at images just for their power, their sheer power, or their poetry that they bring. And I'm finding that now that people have become kind of accustomed to the internet, electronic images, they're starting to get weary of that. And I'm seeing that the generation that had been sort of avoiding collecting physical objects over the last 10 or 15 years is now starting to pay more attention. And that's something that we're certainly equipped to address and to work with. There is one thing I wanted to read that we had. As the next anniversary that we are presenting ourselves with is the 200th anniversary. And that'll be coming up in a few years' time. And I see that things are going to ramp up. And as that approaches, these first photographs that we're dealing with, these earliest, the 19th century, the beginnings of photography, which inspire so many of the contemporary photographers today, they'll take on a new meaning and beauty. And those are the words of Grant Romer, who was predicting this for daguerreotypes. But I believe that this will also be the case for all sorts of other early photographs. That's the sort of thing. It starts off with photographers themselves grasping, taking an interest in this and collecting it for themselves and being inspired by it. And now we're seeing that's gaining some traction. So we're very gratified by that.
Yeah, great.
Yeah.
Thanks. Sarah?
So when I started learning the history of photography, pretty much on the job at the National Gallery, I immersed myself in the canonical histories of photography. I really struggled at first to learn what made a great print. And I think I kind of started from what the foundational history of photography had been with those iconic figures, and still love them. But I think as both the field has changed and I have moved through different museums, my thinking about the 19th century has expanded. One point I think comes out very beautifully in the show at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, but I think can still be explored, is that 19th century photography is fun. It is not just little brown pictures, but it is a very active, engaged, collaborative process, portraiture, the uses for photography if we look beyond sort of, the traditional histories that I first learned. The second thing is that 19th century photography is incredibly radical. And if anybody spends time reading 19th century, photographic journals, as I know Patrick certainly does, and many others in here, I mean, you learn incredible things like photographers who were who were figuring out ways to print photographs on fish or the nail beds. I'm not kidding. So I think part of why so many contemporary artists now are interested in 19th century processes is not just a return to the darkroom and to the hand, but to that sense of broad experimentation, a kind of, it's the startup culture. Also, probably to their chagrin, they realized that they thought they invented something, and then some guy in 1854 had actually done it in their basement as well. But I think the third thing, and maybe what has been most impactful for me, is thinking about the kind of turn to visual culture, to think about photographs not simply in the kind of artificially created category of fine art, but as part of visual culture. And that means thinking about the production end, but the circulation of photographs and the reception and how we use photographs in our daily lives now goes all the way back to the origins. And when I worked at the Peabody Essex Museum, it really got me thinking about moving away from this kind of center periphery model of the circulation of photographs to a global visual culture. And I mean, I think that opens up so many areas of inquiry, along with thinking about, the power dynamics of globalization, of slavery, of, moving transnationally, ideas move, pictures move. So, and then related to that is where these photographs live. I mean, we look to museums, we look to galleries, we look to collectors who have their eyes on these things, but also I think there are untold treasures in probably every state or historical society that we don't necessarily go to look for materials. Artists look for them there, scholars, and so I think the internet can actually help bring us together in thinking more broadly about 19th century visual culture and the incredibly important role that photography played, not just as photographs, but they also get translated into, into wood engravings, and then they get published. And so how does the photograph in the 19th century really transform our notion of ourselves and our global connections? So that's where I think this should go.
Katie.
Well, I just want to pick up on one thing that Sarah was saying about where the photographs exist and people finding new places to look for them. I'm now almost 1 month into my new role at the Canadian Centre for Architecture, the CCA in Montreal, which is an institution, a research institution and a museum that's dedicated to architecture and to where architecture intersects with various aspects of culture and how architecture affects our lives, how it shapes our lives, how it might reshape our lives. And it has an incredible photography collection. There are about 60,000 photographs, individual photographs in the photography collection. A lot of those are in albums. So if you look at just discrete objects, some of which will include multiple photographs, maybe it's about 30,000 objects. And it's incredibly strong in 19th century material. It's a collection that was built in the 1970s and 1980s, 1990s mostly, and has not been very active in collecting photographs over the last 25 years. So we'll see how that changes in the future. But yeah, I would encourage all of you to have a look at the website. Many of the things are digitized, and it's it's a genre of photography, architectural photography, or photography and how it relates to architecture. It's a huge genre in the 19th century, and so many things can be incorporated really into this subject and are part of the subject, even if we haven't necessarily thought of them like that. The 19th century is so expansive in its approaches to photography, though, just as Sarah was saying. And yeah, I mean, and also I think the playfulness that you mentioned that we see in the show at the Met is really important. And it's just amazing that the lines of inquiry that emerge when you start looking at these great collections, of these great varied collections, even if they seem to be focused on one particular subject. And many are not, many are very varied but there's so much to gather there. There are so many threads to pick up. And I think that one thing that's very obvious, but maybe important to state, is that one of the most interesting things about 19th century photography is the 19th century. When I first started coming to this subject as a scholar, I started the way that Sarah did, looking at the canonical photographers. And I remember seeing Balduce's picture of the Toulon train station and thinking, this is like so modern, so beautiful, so striking, and I can't believe that this was made, in the 1850s. And then I'm just thinking, like, so what project is this a part of? Why was this made? What is the context of this? What was happening in France? What was happening in the world? And I think it's important to remember that photography is really one technology among many that was being developed in the 19th century that has completely transformed society. And one of the reasons that the 19th century is so interesting is that that's the century, and maybe 18th century scholars would argue with me on this, that laid the groundwork for modern society, for where we are now. So I think there's a lot to learn about why we are where we are now from this material.
That's great.
I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, I think that's a good start for a discussion.
I would say the groundwork for modern society, but also for modern image making.
Yeah.
I mean, because there's a lot of modernism that you see in the 19th century. Of course, not planned, but we look at it today and we recognize that.
Yeah, I mean that's an interesting question that we might circle back to here, since the title of the panel is On Collecting, or it's part of an On Collecting series. You all are collectors in some sense. Sarah, you've had the opportunity to work with a number of collections, and I imagine the 19th century is probably a smaller portion of the Virginia collection right now, so something that you could build.
But an active one.
And Katie, same thing. Hans, you have to find new things.
Yes.
And Patrick, we now know that you're buying things in your pajamas. So, but I'm curious, how has your process of collecting changed over the years? Has technology's made it different? Has it made it harder? What advice would you give to somebody starting out?
Well, I don't think it's made it harder. I think it's made it easier. The problem is that there's a lot to learn, about processes, about photographers. My first collection I started was of 19th century Caribbean photographs, and I knew nothing about collecting photographs. But I went to the Caribbean a lot on vacation, and I thought, well, let me see if those exist. And so I just started poking around and found that they did exist, and they weren't expensive, and so I could buy things and make mistakes. And so I built this collection based on a fascination with a particular area, and through that, learned about what's an albumin print, what's a daguerreotype, where do you find these things? And I'm not sure that answers your question, but I think that the other thing that's happening now is that there was a canon established in the 20th century, and we're going beyond that. There's still, in France, there's still photographs coming out of people's attics that have been sitting there for 150 years. You'll go onto an auction and you'll see a whole group of photographs by somebody you've never heard of, and very competent photographers. And so, to me, that's what's fascinating, is like to find these things and go, well, who are these guys? Where'd they come from? And also, I've always had a love of history, and especially the history of technology and science. But I didn't, I studied a cursory world history when I was in high school, but didn't know much about France in the 19th century. The Commune, Napoleon III, that whole era, and it's all represented in photographs. So you start with the photographs, and then you just sort of like drill down. Mm-hmm. And also now the primary sources are available on the internet. Where it used to be you have to go to Paris. Too bad,
Right.
to like do the research. But now all these things are online.
Well, so I should point out that the slides that don't have a credit are things from Patrick's collection. All the others indicate where they are. And since you mentioned the commune, and since Sarah brought up printing photographs on fish, maybe would you just like to briefly explain the pigeon
Sure, yeah.
picture?
During, the Franco-Prussian War, the Prussians surrounded France, and they couldn't get anything in or out. And so a guy named René de Grand, came up with the idea to shrink newspapers on microfilm, the first microfilm, and have pigeons carrying them out of Paris, and then just to get them over the enemy lines, and then eventually onto England and various places. So the one on the side there is a facsimile of what they call pigeon post. I don't know that it was entirely successful. I think the pigeons didn't necessarily go where they were supposed to go. But
As long as one of them did.
yeah. But yeah, that's again, that's one of the fascinating things about this area is that this is an example of a practical use of photography that you don't find that necessarily in museum collections or at places like AIPAD. It's a branch that you could collect just in that kind of area, and it would be really interesting.
Right. Hans, you, I think one of the questions that I have heard collectors say about 19th century photography is, well, a lot of the great prints have already been acquired by public institutions. There's not a lot out there. You seem to keep finding new things. How would you respond to that question?
Well, I would say that right now, some of the most avid collectors are museums. Some of the most active ones that we have on the market are the museums themselves, because they're recognizing or they're getting the impression that there's a certain sort of rarity aspect that they need to jump in and grab things while they can. But we're finding also that there are more and more things that are potentially available. When the market starts to pick up a little bit, there will be more things that will come out. There's some people who are holding on to things because they don't want to let them go yet. So there is quite a bit more material left. I mean, earlier this morning I saw an album that I'd never seen before of some of the most extraordinary early British photographs. I thought I would never see something like that, but there it was.
Where did you see that, Hans?
I saw it I was shown it confidentially by a dealer.
By a human.
Yes. by another dealer.
In a room. The lock on
It was not here. So, but anyway, but the other thing is the importance of actually looking at physical objects. I mean, it's more. Yes, you do need to use the internet to do the research. You have this opportunity. But if you can sort of walk into a museum and walk into the study room, make an appointment, and have a look at original works, there's no equivalent to that. I mean, as much as you can learn about it, you need to educate yourself. And this opportunity of seeing physical objects, when the rest of the time you're just looking at your phone or looking at your computer and seeing things there, once you can alter that into seeing the physical objects, that completely transforms the field for you. And that is, whether it's looking at an album of salt prints or an individual, Hill and Adamson or Julia Margaret Cameron, or a daguerreotype, whether it's a daguerreotype by one of the pioneers of photography, or even a daguerreotype by a contemporary artist. There are all these relationships that are very important to establish and to appreciate.
Great. You may want to respond to some of these things, Sarah or Katie, but I'm also curious, as the two people currently in museums, how you also, Sarah, you mentioned kind of new frontiers and opening up other possibilities for 19th century photography inquiry. How would you go about doing that? What are some of those areas that you would be interested in exploring?
Well, I think right now I'm actually sort of going back to the foundations. So our the VMFA's photography collection has grown in fits and starts in kind of a stuttering pace. But since 1936, when the museum opened, our first exhibition of photography was 3 months after the museum opened, and it was a group of oversized gelatin silver prints by Frances Benjamin Johnston. It's a very promising start, first woman, photography, but it kind of petered out from there and restarted again briefly in the 1970s, and then again sort of now. So my challenge, and I think the challenge of every curator, is you build the collection both around what you have, not just in the relevant photography collection, but who are you as an institution and where are you going? So, you know, you're struggling between, do I fill gaps with these canonical figures? Do I move forward? I do both. In the slides that I've selected for this presentation, there are 5 acquisitions we made recently. And what's been important for us, so there are 2 works we might consider canonical, you know, Beautiful Watkins and Julia Margaret Cameron. And the intent behind these is not only so that we can at least start to tell the history of photography, but also we have and will continue to build a very strong collection, for example, of work by Sally Mann. So to have that historical lineage throughout. And we actually have a nice collection of work by Ansel Adams and the sort of school of Ansel Adams after. So to be able to go backwards to Watkins is important. But the other 3 photographs really are more about like our local stories. How do we begin to tell the history of photography kind of in Virginia? So the Pratt daguerreotype, I think it's 1 or 2 before this, is one of a very few groups of daguerreotypes, city views made in Richmond. Lots and lots of portraits, you know, 30,000 supposedly made by Pratt himself, but very few city views. And this is not just sort of a picture about architecture or urban growth, but we know exactly kind of where it was, and we can identify under those porticos, you know, where enslaved people were sold that produced the wealth to allow people to continue to make daguerreotypes. So that actually connects us to a larger story, which we can tell in other areas of our collection. So I'm trying to fill those gaps of early photography with work that goes in different directions. It doesn't just tell the history of photography, but it also tells the history of Richmond and really the history of the United States and then transnational wealth circulating. The next picture is also one that I love. It is a portrait of Gilbert Hunt, who was a renowned Richmonder who was born, who was a blacksmith, who was born enslaved, and was famous for saving people from a major fire, actually twice in Richmond. Eventually acquired his own freedom, went to Liberia with the American Colonization Society, returned to Richmond, and towards the end of his life, produced this salted paper print, which is, as you know, kind of rare in a place like Richmond, which was then sold kind of to support him in his dotage. So we think about Sojourner Truth, and that well-known, I sell the shadow to support the substance, but we have another example here. So I'm trying to think about how to, this is also wonderful for us because we don't have many salted paper prints. So whatever I can do to kind of, Hans is already going to send, I'm going to get an email before the end of this talk with a PDF. But, so I'm trying to figure out, how do we start in 2024? And I don't want to say it's a totally new 19th century collection, but so I want to make really smart choices in that way. And where we find these things, they come from many different places, but I have to actually also just thank Denise Bethel, who knows so much and has been a huge supporter of VMFA, just in connecting us to people who have things of interest.
That's great.
So.
That's great. Katie, you sort of have the opposite situation because the majority of your collection is 19th century. So if you were to kickstart collecting again, what would you be thinking about?
Well, I was just talking about the conundrum, this conundrum with Sarah before we got started. So the collection is incredibly strong in 19th century material, but it's still it still is only a slice of what was being produced at that time, specifically by geography, by gender. There is, I don't know, perhaps not surprisingly, a total dearth of material by practitioners who are not white, not male, and mostly not Western. So, maybe many areas that we can start working on are to try to tell a broader and more diverse story of the history of photography, showing the viewpoints of people who are not the people who had power at that time, or didn't necessarily come from means. There is a lot of photography in the collection that was not produced in the West, but and I've included some of it here, a photograph from an album of views of Tunisia and Algeria. So this is a studio portrait that was made in Algeria. We don't know the name of the photographer yet, around 1885, and this would be one of these Orientalist portraits that were available for purchase by people that were visiting there or Europeans that lived there. There were many already living there at the time, as Algeria was really part of France at the time. This portrait I find really striking because the two men in it seem to have a bond, first of all, and also seem to have such presence. It's also, we are an architecture center, so there aren't that many portraits in the collection, and this is a really beautiful one.
Surprising.
So yeah, we have many albums like this that were created by people who were traveling through places or who were part of these colonialist or imperialist regimes that were established in these places, and photography used as part of these regimes of imperial control, colonial control. So that is certainly represented in the collection. It would be nice if we had some material from non-Western regions of the world that provided more of an insider's view into these parts of the world and into various cultures. How much of that is around on the market? How much of that is still to be discovered? I don't know. So yeah, we'll be looking for some.
That's great.
Good.
So obviously, you've all mentioned that new technologies, new organizations have made collecting photography easier, but I'm curious if with all the information out there that you can learn now, has it also increased competition for some of the things that you're looking for? And a kind of adjacent question is, can you make discoveries anymore? I mean, Hans, you just mentioned one. And what are some of your favorite discoveries?
Well, for instance, one of the things that I discovered was at this fair. There was a Charles Leander Weed photograph of one of the earliest mammoth plate photographs made in Yosemite, which is something I bought on the first day when I saw it, because it's something I'd always been after. But going back to the images that I've chosen here, I mean, the work that you're seeing on the screen here is by Julien Valou de Villeneuve, a French photographer who started off being a painter and a lithographer, and then he took up photography for the service of painting. And his photographs were used by artists like Courbet. This one in particular was a model for Courbet's Atelier du Peintre, which is at the Musée d'Orsay, this large painting of this entire circle of the intelligentsia and the art world of Paris. Can you turn? That's a little very small daguerreotype. It's a 9th plate daguerreotype by Starkweather of Boston, of this evocative figure of this man, which is a picture that I pulled out because I wanted to show something that was, in keeping with that I thought made me think of the wonderful exhibition at the Met, of Willie Schaefer's collection, which has been drawing, as I understand, an incredible audience. There were 2,500 people who came to the opening, and 20,000 people who visited in the first 2 weeks. That must break all records for a photographic exhibition at the Met. But it was certainly a very, very impressive and well worthwhile for anybody to go see. And I can only see that this is the sort of thing that's going to turn some heads and wake some people up who may not be aware of that particular aspect of these some of them very small pictures, but they pack an incredible impact. That's a William Henry Fox Talbot that we're showing, which harkens back to the photomechanical process, which Patrick was talking about before. This is one of the earliest examples of photomechanical printing. It's one that where Talbot was able to marshal the power of the printing press to print his images. And in this case, he's printing a single image of this piece of gauze twice, once straight up, once slightly to the side, and creating the beginnings of the halftone. So this is something that he was really after when he realized some of his photographs were fading. So.
Well, yeah, just before this started, we were all discussing that the origins of photomechanical printing is an interest of everybody up here, and we've all been interested in it for a long time, but it's becoming even more important now, especially since, as Sarah pointed out, all of the output methods these days are ink on paper, you know, and so there's a really interesting corollary, again, with the 19th century. Let's see.
Oh, and can you go to the two together? Yeah, there we go. These are two by William Henry Fox Talbot. The one on the left is of an asparagus fern, and that dates from about 1840-41. It's a photogram made by placing the image directly, the plant directly on a piece of photographic paper and exposing it to the sunlight and developing it. This one was developed most likely with hypo, so it's relatively stable, but we don't want to, we're not certain. But this one and the one next to it of the oak tree, which is an in-camera image that Talbot made, so you have the micro and the macro idea in nature, is something that I felt related to, if you can go back to Hiroshi Sugimoto's lightning fields. In this case, it's called Talbotized, which is a name that he gave it because he was using Talbot's electrostatic discharge wand to make that in his darkroom. And he was risking his life holding this electrode attached to a Van de Graaff generator and creating this amazing image. So you're seeing here where a contemporary photographer is using, sorry, is that me? Is using the inspiration from one of the inventors of photography to create his image. And you're seeing sort of an exuberance there of electricity. So that's something, this is one example of things that I'm seeing happening throughout the field.
And how it relates to today.
Yeah,
exactly.
I would add to that too. One of the pictures I included is a daguerreotype by J.P. Ball, which I acquired in part because Ball is a Virginian artist and an important, daguerreotypist, and the most prominent black daguerreotypist, primarily working in Cincinnati. And it's a beautiful picture. Yeah. But also because at the time we were organizing showing of Isaac Julian's Lessons of the Hour, which the VMFA commissioned. And Isaac Julian was inspired by J.P. Ball. And so I think also we're in a moment of sometimes letting artists lead us to think anew about the 19th century is one of the more creative ways that we can re-engage with our collections or see new things in them. So we installed this along with a small group of daguerreotypes of Black Americans and carte de visites and other material in relation to Isaac Julian and sort of Frederick Douglass's idea around photography and representation. But I think the connection with contemporary artists is a really important way to reinvigorate the field and kind of show people how radical the 19th century was. So.
That's great.
And also some of these contemporary artists themselves are collectors. And they've always led the way. I mean, artists have always collected each other's work going back historically. But lately I'm noticing that there are a number of contemporary artists who are, starting to build their own collections of historical works as inspirations, as touchstones for themselves. So that's also.
That's great. Katie or Patrick, a discovery that you were particularly...
I'd like to make a plug, actually, for what I'm collecting now.
Yeah.
One of the really important activities at the beginning of photography was the reproduction of art. All major photographers from Talbot, the Gray, Baldus, all these people, except for Talbot, they had to make a living, and a lot of them were engaged in the reproduction of artworks, and yet nowadays, you look at black and white photographs of a color painting, and you go, oh, what's the big deal? Well, it was a big deal then, and it's an under-collected field, and it's just filled. I've been able to actually find a photograph of a piece of art and then actually acquire the piece of art also, which, it just makes collecting a lot of fun. And it's enabled me to also learn much more about Rembrandt engravings and, all the kinds of things that were being done there. So, there are fields of collecting like that I think are overlooked. It's stuff is out there to be found.
Well, in the very beginning, when Talbot first achieved a reproduction of an artwork, whether it was an engraving or a piece of lace or anything, to him that was just as important as a landscape or a portrait. Because here he was able to reproduce in a single moment what would have taken a copyist quite a long time to record.
Yeah, in those days also, if you wanted to see a piece of art, you had to go to where it was, or look at an engraving that somebody did. But now, for the first time, you could actually acquire these prints for not a lot of money of, Rembrandt, Dürer, all these great artists.
Wasn't the first photograph was an art reproduction?
Yeah.
Right?
It was.
Niepce's photography art reproduction of the
Cardinal
Cardinal
Yeah.
was an engraving, which a lot of people don't consider, which brings us back to the photomechanical topic. A lot of people, well, I don't know how much most people think about this, but in the literature, it's often not considered the first photograph specifically because it's a photomechanical print. But I think we're witnessing a turn now toward considering photomechanical processes as really not only part of the story of what photography is, but really central to what story of photography is and how photography developed. I did my dissertation on Baldus's work in photogravure, and I guess I started that project in 2015. And at that time, it really seemed like there was not a lot of writing that had been done on this, and not a lot of talk about it. And now there's a little bit more. I would say that it's still not a huge area, but the American Institute of Conservation put together a really great conference. I guess it was the end of 2023, and invited scholars and curators and conservators to all come together and talk about various aspects of this field in photography. And there were a lot of people.
Great.
Yeah, a lot of people and a lot of really interesting papers and different angles on this subject, and that is something that was not happening when I was first working on that topic. So I think kind of the more we know, the more we know. And with the amazing amount of digitized material that's online now, it just seems like we're going to be there's just always more to uncover in this area. It's just amazing the way that things just continually, just continue to bubble up to the surface.
Yeah. Well, those stories, the Cardinal d'Amboise, the Niepce, and Talbot's early reproductive work just reminds me that the origins of photography were about reproduction, which is something that sometimes we kind of get away from, but it brings me back to what Sarah was saying about visual culture and thinking about how we can look at photography, not just as a set of images, but things that were circulated, who used them, why, and how did they make their way in the world. We're getting short on time, and we did want to open it up for questions, but one last question for everybody. What one piece of advice would you give to somebody interested in collecting 19th century photographs?
Visit Hans's booth.
Yeah, go to Hans's booth.
Thank you, Patrick. Well, I would say the best thing to do is just to look at as much as you can. And whether it's going to museum exhibitions, going to dealers' galleries, going to libraries, and somehow pestering the curators to open up the study rooms to let you look at things. That's really important. Once you see things online, if anything that piques your interest, try to look at the originals. That's really the most important thing you can do. And once you do that, once you develop, it takes a certain amount of patience. And patience is something not many people have. But as we get more into it, as we age, as we discover the world, we'll find that this is a very good refuge, especially as the world is such a complicated place today, which we won't get into. But these are things that are quite stable, and you can look at them and you can just lose yourself in these in a particular area of collecting. I mean, whether it's photography or anything else, but for me, it's 19th century photography, and that's something that I just get endless satisfaction from. And I think other people can too. There's something infectious about it. So, anyway.
Yeah, I would say, visit auction galleries, sometimes you can see not just photographs, everything, but you can see the most amazing sort of collection of different kinds of photography all in one place. And usually the auctioneer or the gallery owner will be happy to talk to you and sort of tell you what the significance is. So again, I agree on seeing the things in person. Although you can also, looking on the internet, everything is available. It's a good starting point. There's so many different blogs and museum sites. Most museums now have their collections online. You can spend a day just like cruising and finding the most amazing things.
You can, but don't get hooked on that, because the moment you can easily get lost doing that.
Sorry,
You have to,
I already am, but
you have to remind yourself that somehow, if going out of the screen and grabbing because these are artifacts. Each one of these photographs is an artifact, and it has a physical quality. Each photographic print, at least in the 19th century, you can see distinct differences, and when you feel them in your hand, there's something to be said for that. So,
Sarah, your advice?
What they said. I don't know. Be the first person to show up at Lumiere des Roses, and if you've got a low price point. No, I was actually, you said the word stable. And one thing I think maybe is a misconception among people starting out is they feel like 19th century photography is inaccessible and somehow more fragile. And, these photographs have lasted and will last longer than my childhood photos. So, don't be scared. And you can start small, like literally physically small. Like you could find a wonderful carte de visite of some French actress or something that may just grab your attention. So I would say, don't be intimidated.
Great.
and there are things available, as Sarah says, at every price point. So
Flea markets.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I would also just echo what Hans said. Just look at as much as you can, and beyond that, make friends in the area. It's a great group of people.
yeah,
It's a great
it's a
network
community
of people.
that we have, and that's something that we certainly we welcome people of all ages. So.
So we are going to open it up for a few questions. I think there's we've got some hands already. While the microphone is heading to those hands, I just wanted to say that there are a number of places where you can go see 19th century photography shows, either right now or coming up. Obviously, the Met's exhibition, for which we have Willie Schaefer to thank for a wonderful collection. And then I know that there's the Julia Margaret Cameron show that
Coming up
was
at the
in
Morgan
London and
Library
Paris.
in a few
Will be at the
months.
Morgan
Yeah.
at the end of May. And there may be others, so share this information with people. First question.
I'm thinking back during the
Can you speak into the microphone?
on,
There you go.
where the Gutenberg Bible wanted to look like a manuscript and I was wondering, in the beginning of photography, I see again, the inspiration because they're so close to other methods of imagery, but they also evoke. And the other thing is, I've learned a lot about early photography by doing some of the processes myself. And I mean, you really learn all the pitfalls and the slowness and the thought and everything that goes into it. So when you see an object, doesn't matter, you know, is to learning underneath how it's done. But could you talk about the similarity around 1500, a little before, the incunables, and then the incunables of photography, and how much they were inspired by the people who went before them?
Well, certainly the invention of photography is one of the great milestones, or perhaps the biggest milestone in reproduction since the invention of printing. And Talbot recognized that from the start. Included in his Pencil of Nature is an example of reproducing an incunable page, as well as reproducing a drawing and photographing lace. And the people who saw these things at the time, they accused him of trying to be deceptive. You're showing me, you say that this is a photograph of lace? We're sure it's the lace itself, until they came up and touched it, and they were surprised. So yes, there is a very similar, it's a similar time point when the photography was coming about. Yeah.
And to your Gutenberg example, there are a couple of examples in the early history of photography of paper printmakers changing their recipes, so to speak, to make them look more contrasty black and white, like an engraving, because the sort of thing that we think of as beautiful now, these rich brown tones that are, you know, visible in some of the pictures we've seen, were sort of misleading to some people interested in those images. So they tried to make them look like other things.
And also, the Pencil of Nature itself is actually rarer than the Gutenberg Bible, to have a complete Pencil of Nature. So,
crazy. Another question.
I want to thank the panel for your insights. Let's make a cocktail. Condition, artist, subject matter. How do you make your cocktail? How do you guys mix those?
That's interesting. So you didn't hear the question was condition, artist, subject matter. How do you evaluate those things together? What's the right recipe, the right cocktail? All three have to be excellent.
well, but sometimes the artist is an artist.
Yeah.
And as in Willie's collection,
Yeah.
the majority of the pictures in that show at the Met are by unknown photographers, and that itself is quite eye-opening.
For me, it's really, how does this object fit into the history of photography? You know, I mean, my collection has a lot of fine art prints, but it also has a lot of prints that are not so great, but either it's the best there is of that particular photographer, or it adds to the story. You know, I mean, there's so many different aspects, so many different attempts to do different processes, and you know that you don't always have to have, in my opinion, the best quality print. It's a desirable, but if it doesn't exist or you can't afford it, you know, and you're trying to tell a story, other things will suffice.
And there's quite a difference in prices between the best available print or the best existing print and another.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I'll say that, you know, my own thinking about, you know, those questions have changed because it really depends on the particular object itself. You know, the Gilbert Hunt portrait, I have seen better prints of it. I don't think we'll be able to get one. But it was important enough as an object that the condition issues that might be a problem with another work of art were not a problem for me, because I felt that the story and the importance it has for us and for our collection outweighed, you know, now maybe I could wait 10 years and try to buy it off somebody that I know has a great print, but we wanted to be able to share it and show it now. Artists used to, yes, we all have the check lists in our mind of artists, but I don't think that that is the driving factor. Otherwise, you just have all the collections looking the same. And so much of what I have learned is from the research and exhibitions and collections built by my colleagues. So I think moving that aside allows us to really then engage with the object and sort of how it was used. I think the one thing is just, there are a lot of very pedestrian pictures, and I have to catch myself, because sometimes I just like photographs. You know, even a bad photograph is good because it's a photo, you know, like, so that's where, you know, sometimes you have to sort of check yourself and make sure that it is worth buying for the institution. But I'm much more open to all of those questions than I used to be.
Well, I just wanted to point out one picture, which to me has been always one of the highlights of 19th century photography, is this Baron Gros of the Acropolis, which is a full-plate daguerreotype that is in the Canadian Center for Architecture.
Hans is doing my job for me right now.
And when you stand in front of that daguerreotype, which I did for the first time back in like 1981 or 82, when it was shown at the Cooper Hewitt Museum as part of the CCA collection that Richard Pear had put together. It's one of those, the colors and the composition of it, as you see it from different angles, you see the colors shifting from a pink to a green, and it really is it's a poetic experience. And when you, it's worth a trip up to Montreal to see that, and persuade Katie to pull it out.
And you know, speaking about the network, I didn't know that we had this until we were preparing for this conversation, and my colleagues here said, you have to go downstairs right now and see this one thing, and yeah, it is stunning.
And we were all jealous that she could just
Yes.
walk downstairs and see it. Another question.
Hi. So, as someone who does scour antique stores and flea markets, is there a way to identify who took the photograph, especially the mid-century stuff? Because I find a lot of these, like the daguerreotypes, there's no signature, there's no identifying marks. You know, sometimes you can figure it out by where you find the image, but do you have any recommendations for maybe identifying who took the photograph?
In many cases, in the case of cased images, it's unlikely that you will find out. And it doesn't really matter. There are certain hallmarks that you can use to identify the work of certain photographers. But in general, if the image moves you, that's the most important thing.
Yeah, I'll add that, especially with cased images, sometimes there is a name, a debossed name or a printed name on the case, and even that isn't always reliable because cases and objects, images have switched over the years. Sometimes people will put together a nice case with a good image. So you always have to be wary of that. But it's part of the fun, trying to figure out who it might be. And I think there are resources out there. There are a couple of, there's Craig's Daguerrean Registry, which kind of lists all the active daguerreotypists and their studio addresses. So if you have an address on it, or if there's any indication, there are some resources you could go to.
Sometimes there'll be something like the carpet or a chair or that is recognized as being from a certain studio. You know, in the Daguerrean Society, there's always somebody who knows, oh, well, that carpet, you know, was used by this photographer. So you dig deep enough, you can actually, you know, find some clues.
Thank you for those presentations. I was really fascinated by them. I work with a 19th century photography archive, but in India. So my reference points come from there. And I was interested in your thinking about, I'm thinking about usually non-Western contexts of either collecting or engaging with an archive more generally. So I suppose my question to you was regarding your sense of aesthetics. I mean, at one level, when one is looking at 19th century photography, the assumption is that there's an aesthetic line of engagement, either by way of subject matter and so on and so forth. What you might consider of value to acquire here might be very differently, you know, assumed by us in India or the non-Western context. So I only mentioned this to ask you a question about, was there a moment in your individual collection practices where there was a radical shift in your thinking about what is a good image or what should be acquired? Because for us, we work as a charitable educational institution, so collection is mandated on dissemination and what will be done with that image eventually. So if that provides some, I hope that's clear enough.
It's a great question. I mean, I'll start and then let the others, and I think this will have to be our last question, but yeah, I don't know if there was ever a real shift in my thinking about what made a good image. I think I was always open to a wide variety of things. However, I do think that the kind of newer generation of curators has really been consciously trying to shift what museums perceive as a good image, and I do think that there is a very specific kind of Western aesthetic that has dominated, a certain part of the kinds of shows that we put together in this country. But I do think that's changing, and I think there are corollaries even within the United States. If you want to think about, for example, I had the good fortune to work with a colleague at the New Orleans Museum of Art on the history of Black American studio photography. And that was a totally different set of criteria for which we evaluated what belonged in that history. So, I'll let some of the others sort of respond to that as well.
Yeah, I think it's, I don't think there was one moment or shift for me. I think it's more of a slow burn, right? And it's that we learn and then we have to unlearn. We have to unlearn, the way we saw something. And I think I learn a lot just from looking at things that my colleagues do, but I think also encountering other collections that are organized in different ways through a different sort of series of priorities. Or, as we've sort of mentioned before, how artists look at 19th century photography or really other material is often very different than the way I approach it, which is kind of this historic lens, how it's a fair collection, how much does it cost, whatever. So I think being open to dialogues, I'd be really interested in visiting your archive. We chatted a little yesterday. Yeah, so.
I think it would be wonderful to see a collaboration between the vision of your archive and the vision of, for instance, the Canadian Center for Architecture, which has an amazing collection of photographs of India. And it would be fascinating, I think, for all of us to see what could come out of that.
Yeah, I think from my own perspective, I might just say that as I got kind of deeper and deeper in scholarship into more kind of esoteric areas of photographic history, I became a lot more excited by things that were recognizable as attempts at something, where something hadn't quite been pulled off, where you could sort of start seeing the beginnings of something or a kind of shift in what somebody's trying to do, or all kinds of mistakes and just kind of these oddities. I mean, mostly in terms of process, because that's what I was looking at. But yeah, I think if you take that and you apply it to subject, or you apply it to, I don't know, just personal viewpoint, then things could get pretty interesting.
I think that we're all sort of dealing with mostly the Western canon of photography and what is collected by museums and sort of official organizations. But if you go around the world, there are all kinds of archives, historical societies, foreign offices of governments that collected photographs from their colonies. I mean, there's so many different kinds of photographs that are not sort of part of the history of photography by well-known photographers canon that, I'm sure in your Indian one, you've got a lot of photographs that were never distributed in the West that, we don't come across.
Yeah.
And it takes a lot of work to go look at those things, but in the UK, for example, there's all kinds of photography collections that are not, you know, part of the history of photography, but have amazing images in them.
The India Office Library in London certainly has
Yeah.
incredible things as well.
Well, I want to thank our panelists for being here. I want to thank you all for coming today. And everybody's going to go buy a 19th century photograph, right? After this,
Thank you, Russell.
Thank you, Russell.